Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast, the show that brings you the latest insights, thought leadership, and stories from across the global mining industry. In today's show, we have Paul Weibel, who's the CEO of 5E Advanced Materials. Since his last appearance on Dig Deep, Boron has been added to the US critical minerals list. Supply chain security has become even more and even greater priority, and 5E has continued advancing its Fort Cady project in California. In this conversation, we're going to discuss the growing strategic importance of boron, the impact of shifting geopolitical and supply chain dynamics, progress at Fort Cady, financing critical mineral projects in today's market, and the key milestones for investors they should be watching out for over the next 12 to 18 months. Paul, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to be here today.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming back on the show. For those that didn't listen to the previous episode, I just wanted you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your career before we go into the questions. And obviously, those that didn't listen to the previous episode, appreciate if you could go back and listen to that after listening to this. So I hand it over to you, Paul.
Yeah, great to be here again. 5E is we're a boron-based project. We're located in California. Over the last 2+ years, we've been operating more so a demonstration plant. We'll mine boron, which is the fifth element on the periodic table. It's very much a super mineral in that it's light, heat resistant, energy dense, microbial. Was recently added to USGS critical minerals list. It had always sat as a strategic material per the Defense Logistics Agency. This was validation that boron really is important. It's now more mainstream, as noted on the USGS list. Really added because, and it's a couple critical reasons. One, the boron goes into 300 plus applications and makes life as we know it exist. That, really, if you think about some of the specialty borates, boron carbide, that's what the U.S. government uses to make Kevlar and tank armor. That production comes out of China. Ferroboron, which is a critical component, 20% of permanent magnets are ferroboron. Obviously, there's a ton of attention on rare earths, but the ferroboron piece is very much, again, Chinese dominated. And then, structurally at the mineral level, you have this classic oligopoly. Two companies control 80 to 85% of global supply. The U.S. supplier is a depleting asset. It's actually for sale right now. And really, there's a single point of failure in the United States. Once that line goes away, basically the U.S. loses its position of strength. And so really interesting times in the borate markets as we speak with Rio for sale. There's a second smaller borate producer, more as a byproduct. They actually just filed Chapter 11 today in the U.S. bankruptcy courts. And, I think the U.S. government got this right and added boron as a critical mineral. 5E is ultimately that next up and comer, and we're very much in a development cycle focused on contracting for offtakes.
Since your last appearance on Dig Deep, a lot has changed for 5E and for the critical minerals landscape broadly. What has this past year taught you about leading a company like 5E in today's environment?
Yeah, so listen, I think when we first spoke, boron wasn't a critical mineral. We had, gone through, we had probably just completed a smaller equity raise. And then since then, it's been and we've just published our pre-feasibility study so investors could kind of understand the true economics behind the project. And I think since then we've done another equity raise, so we have significant runway today, and that really gives us the time to really focus on the business. Is pretty simple. It's focusing on the commercial contracts, and which we can talk about here. And it's been a little bit more de-risking on the wellfield side. But I think as you think about from a CEO lens, when you're in this development phase, it's about, and you're thinking about, we need to raise 435 million, of which a significant portion will be debt. You got to think about this from the lender's eyes. What are they going to look at? How are they going to view this as a de-risked asset? And everything we've done has really been viewed from the lens of what's someone going to think about as they seek to underwrite the debt for this project.
Obviously, since we last spoke, and as you've alluded to, Boron has been added to the US critical minerals list. Where does Fort Cady stand today? And what has obviously this destination change of obviously in practical terms for financing, customer conversation, and government engagement?
Sure. I think we're very real because we've taken product that's actually been mined or solution that's been mined, processed that into our finished product, and we've qualified 14 plus industry segment and customers. So we've done it. We're demonstrating we're real. The deposit can be mined, it's economic, and actually we can meet customer specifications. The customer qualification is clearly takes a bit of a process because what boron goes into, every customer has a spec. They care about the sulfates and chlorides, and as well as particle size, moisture content, and we've been able to demonstrate, hey, we can do this. So that's been a big emphasis, and now it's turned those discussions as the U.S. market and kind of it's now dovetailing into the global, like the boron supply deficit is here. We're seeing uptick in prices. I've actually seen, we subscribe to a pricing platform where both Asia and Indian spot prices are at $1,400 a metric ton. We heard third party customer, a large customer said, you know, again, that customer's contracted at fairly decent prices. But outside that contract, if they want to buy boric acid in just a spot market, if their demand ticks up and they need additional product, they're at 1,400 a ton. So we now have multiple data points that are indicative that the prices are going higher, and that's being driven on a supply crunch. And so on the back of the supply crunch, it's given the company an opportunity to actually go and talk to customers and talk about contracting structure that we're going to need to underpin debt financing. And that's either a fixed pricing contract or some sort of collared structure with a floor and a ceiling that ultimately lenders can clearly model revenue. And after they look at our mass energy balances, our variable cost profile, the fixed cost profile, and any debt capacity, that we can ultimately have contracts that can get this project financed.
Obviously, boron is now being discussed alongside lithium, rare earths, and graphite in critical mineral conversations. Why has it become increasingly strategic, and where are you seeing the strongest demand signals globally?
So what's interesting is maybe about 6 to 7 weeks ago, we actually published and put out economic numbers for a lithium PEA we've done. So our main mineral is colmanite. That's a calcium-based boron mineral, and that's really embedded with lithium-rich clays. And so what we typically see when we recover solution is 10,000 the ppms of boron in solution. We're consistently about 50 to 70 ppms of lithium chloride in solution. And so when we were going through the pre-feed phase, we actually said, okay, do we want to add lithium to scope? And the reality is at commercial phase, we're 130,000 tons of boric acid production and maybe 500 tons of lithium. And at the time, the lithium price just it was $8 a kg. And so we actually kind of put that on the back burner, focused on the boron and the calcium side. And then now that you've seen lithium prices kind of recover, we added that into, we did a bolt on and kind of did the initial prelim economics. And so, you know, now in addition to boron being critical, we'll also produce a lithium byproduct stream, which is quite interesting. And so now you have a more diversified critical minerals portfolio. So I think that's really interesting for us because it adds alternative financing options. We've always contemplated a royalty. And, I've always been a little bit apprehensive to want to put a royalty on a boron, which is our primary product. Now that you have a lithium byproduct stream, and listen, we're going to use solar evap ponds to process this. This is like not novel technology. This is what they do in the Atacama every day of the week. We're blessed being in the high desert of California. It's a very similar climate to that northern Atacama region. So like once you're in a pond, it's just time and evaporation. And so the technology risk is very low. And so you could toggle on an additional financing stream, really that's more of a prepayment and adds just tools to the toolbox. I think from like the demand profile, listen, we talked about that other borate producer that filed Chapter 11 today. Listen, they left the market. They had produced about maybe 50, 60,000 tons of boric acid. They exited that market in kind of February. And that officially, just that small amount of product really pushed the US market into a deficit. And what we've seen is that really it's not any specific industry. It's like it's all markets that use a boric acid are domestically very, very tight. And what we anticipate is that we're right at the start of contracting season. So you're talking 2027 contracts, they're being negotiated now. Like customers with, producers, they're negotiating next year's contracts. And since February, anyone who was buying boric acid out of Asia was relatively insulated from that supply shock that occurred in the domestic markets. You saw all these customers that were contracting with this other producer, like they got a force majeure notice and their world got, you know, turned upside down. And so they were left scrambling, begging and borrowing with a couple what is traditionally captive South American producers, Russia Bohr, and Eddie to basically say, hey, like, what can you give me on product? And prices went up. And a lot of customers, like, their manufacturing capacity is down because they can't get their borate product. And so the Asian markets were really kind of like still calm waters up until now. And what's happened is those waves that happened on this side of the Pacific have now rippled over to the other side of the Pacific, and that's really very much impacting pricing discussions. And ultimately, what have we seen? I've seen it on two independent sources. Spot prices are $1,400 a ton over there in Asia.
This episode is sponsored by Mining International. In today's market, finding the right mining talent isn't easy. Mining International works closely with mining companies to identify and secure senior and technical professionals through a tailored search approach. If you're hiring or exploring your options, you can contact Rob Tyson via the show notes to start a conversation today.
Trade tensions, tariffs, and supply chain fragmentation continues to reshape critical mineral markets. How do those dynamics affect the strategic case for a domestic boron source like Fort Cady?
Yeah, I listen, we were at a industry conference for one of the big industries that are buyers and the significant demand in the domestic market. And so obviously, what was the irony is like this is a more of a traditional industrial application, but it supports North American housing, which you think about that, like North American housing is a big market. And there was maybe 13 to 15 40 people at this industry show, maybe 13 CEOs, and then they had some of their team members, and then you had two existing suppliers and one prospective supplier. That's 5E. But you had both contacts from Eddie and Rio there. And what's interesting is you're talking about a major component that goes into North American housing. Two global suppliers is basically the only game in town right now. And Eddie, there's a tariff on Turkish product, and Eddie actually was, kind of took an initial customer friendly stance in that they were going to bear the cost of that tariff. And what they kind of said is moving into 27, that's no longer an Eddie obligation. We're going to be passing that tariff on. So I think policy definitely can be the tail that wags the dog. And the United States ultimately has taken a position here that, we want domestic production. And on the boron market, there's really one. And it's a depleting asset. So I think, you know, the U.S. government got it right. Obviously, wish we would have seen boron as a critical mineral maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But they at least got it right, and it's there now. And I think it was needed, and it was very justified.
Financing conditions for critical mineral projects remain challenging, yet governments are increasingly prioritizing domestic supply chain. How is 5E navigating that intersection of private capital, strategic capital, and government-backed funding?
Yeah, we got a couple work streams in the pipeline. Obviously, we did an equity raise. We did a $36 million public offering that was 4 times oversubscribed in February. That gave us ample runway. And listen, I think a bolstered up balance sheet was necessary, and it's given us the runway to really kind of execute on the business plan, rather than kind of focusing every 5, 6 months on like, okay, where's the next dollars coming from? And I think that that successful raise was a function of where we are in the business from a de-risk standpoint, also from a credibility and execution standpoint. Now, so we're gearing up to get ready for feed engineering. We've been focusing on, there's a smaller XM loan we've been talking to XM about. We're very much in the throngs of diligence on that. Also, we have applied for a DOE grant for approximately $31 million. Again, it will be a very competitive process. That's, kind of waiting on bated breath. Did we win that award? We're hearing in the next few weeks, and winners should be announced. That would be a major catalyst for the company. Uh, and then there's another application actually that's due in about 2 hours time that we have put together in the last like week and a half. It's an interesting application in that it's sponsored by DIPSI, which stands for the Defense Industrial Base Consortium. And it starts with a very brief white paper. If you do well with that and they like your idea, that'll move on to a full application. And if they like your full application, you get invited to a panel in Philadelphia at their conference where you pitch your idea Shark Tank style, and you'll kind of get an award on the spot. So a little bit unconventional per se, but there's obviously the non-dilutive pools that we're targeting, and that's a smaller XM loan as well as a grant pool. And listen, I think we marketed that raise that like, I don't want to have to come back to the public markets here. I think there's different tools in the financing package, with obviously shorter form debt, non-dilution on the grants, and then ultimately the larger cap raise on the debt. And the thinking is if we can do this smaller EMP loan, we then have the ability, as we're getting ready for the larger project debt finance, to just refi that in. And then obviously, there will be an ask of, I think when we're ready, but like the US government is investing in good equity projects. And so like, do you go in and bring on, when the time's right, the US government as a potential strategic equity investor? So I think that's kind of the way we're thinking it. And then the other, like we talked about that lithium stream, listen, that's a great like financing tool now at 500 tons, $18 a kg. Man, like you could stream on that and get an upfront payment from a real group here, that because it's gonna, it's just a very low risk from a technology perspective, because this is how lithium's produced all the time.
What are the key milestones investors and stakeholders should be watching for over the sort of next 12 to 18 months?
For sure, it's offtake, like a big emphasis on the offtake and the commercial contracts. And we're not really privy to get into who the customers are. That's Listen, when you're trying to break into a global oligopoly, you kind of got to play a little bit of poker and keep your cards to the vest. But we'll be transparent on pricing structure. Again, the last we did do our first offtake agreement. It was 7,500 tons of boric acid up to 10,000. At full run rate will be about 130,000 tons of boric acid. What's modeled in year one is about 90,000 tons of boric acid. So you can't just go sell out 130,000 tons in year one. You kind of have to segue into that. So you would target kind of 50,000 tons under contract in year one. Maybe you keep 10 to 20,000 in the spot market. And then you can, as you're going through that diligence process, you can bolt on another couple contracts. And then in year two, you got to get closer to like 100 to 110,000 tons under contract. And then you start to run. And so 2026 from a catalyst perspective is really going to be a big emphasis on offtakes. Another catalyst is, listen, we talked about the DOE grant. Again, it's going to be a very competitive process. I think, we've talked to different groups that have also applied, again, reputable organizations. So I think like we like our merits on our technical application. But I think, again, going to be competitive. But again, that would be a major catalyst that, would be non-dilutive, extend runway, also be some level of contribution into the larger, broader CapEx plan. And then, yeah, I think at some point we'll give floor notice to proceed. And then you're kind of off to the races, because the goal here, and it's a little tricky, but you need to have one holistic work stream where, you have your customer kind of term sheets, heads of agreement all signed up. You're got to progress them to binding purchase agreements. You're applying for a larger debt facility, and you're moving in conjunction with feed engineering, because feed's about $8.5 to $9 million spend. And we use Fluor out of Greenville, South Carolina. They're going to have a lot of engineers on that. You don't want to start feed until you're truly like, you feel very good and you're ready. Because if you stop and you start with that much kind of manpower, it's really inefficient to have any stopping and starting. Once you hit the go button, you really want to go, because that's how you can ensure you're on time and on budget.
And lastly, if you could send one message to policymakers and investors about boron and what is at stake, what would that be?
Yeah, I'd applaud them for getting this right, and that ultimately, yeah, like the U.S. is a net exporter because we have a producer here that's 20 to 25% of global supply. I think we were kind of talking about encouraging them to add boron to the critical minerals list. When you looked at actually the public comment process, there was 8 or 9 actual, you know, you could go to the Federal Register and see 8 or 9 public comments of groups advocating for boron to be added. It was. So I'd be applauding policymakers that they got it right. Uh, I think the Rio sale that's going to occur here is going to be very interesting. You now have a second smaller producer that has essentially exited the boric acid market. And listen, the deficit's here. So whatever additional tools can be deployed to uh, adopt somewhat of a Chinese mentality. The Chinese, they have that 100-year plan. In the US, we live 2, 4, 6 years at a time based on election cycles. So the US government got this right. They added boron as a critical mineral at the right time. But again, put on that Chinese thinking hat and say, like, okay, how can we be strategic here? Because we do have a depleting asset, and there's no other projects here that can produce in the near term. How can we ensure that ultimately we continue to maintain our flag that's in the ground and are an exporter here for many generations to come? Because like, while it was the right call to add boron as a critical mineral, again, like, there's still uncertainty and there's still risk that the US loses its position of strength.
Paul, really appreciate your time. Thank you for obviously sharing your story, telling us about 5E Advanced Materials, and obviously everything about boron as well. So if our audience wants to reach out to you, if they want to ask questions, obviously follow the story, and obviously receive news releases, how can they go about doing that, and what social media platform channels are you on?
Sure, we're on Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as our press releases have PRA and Hayden IR's contact information. We have a weekly call. Listen, I'm pretty dynamic with investors, whether it's WhatsApp. I kind of have a view as like, as the CEO of the public company, I have an open door. Like, can take criticism, can take questions. Always keen to have a dialogue. Make myself available to our shareholder base. So listen, if you can't get me direct, you can definitely get Paula or Brett, and then they'll pass it up, or we'll set up a call. Happy to make myself available.
Great. We'll include those in the show notes that come in this episode for easy access, so our listeners can reach out to you and follow the story. So thank you again. All the best for the rest of this year. And hopefully we will chat soon.
Awesome. Great. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, appreciate your continued support, and appreciate if you can share this episode far and wide. Obviously, we're talking about a new material or Boron. And I don't think we've had this material on before. So appreciate if you can share the episode to educate our mining industry and even people outside of our mining industry as well, as it has been just put onto the US critical minerals list. So it's obviously an important strategic material that's needed. So thank you again for listening. And until next time, happy mining.